A very good evening to all pious yogis. So this uh, evening, I shall uh, explain about the simile of the monkey mind. Uh, um, um, this simile is explained in one of the discourses um, found in the Samyutta Nikaya. So I shall quote one of the paragraph. Um, um, the Buddha said um, that which is called mind and mentality and consciousness arises as one thing and ceases as another by day and by night. Just as a monkey roaming through a forest grabs hold of one branch, lets that go, and grabs another, then lets that go and grabs still another. So too, that which is called mind and mentality and consciousness arises as one thing and ceases as another by day and by night. So, as you know, the monkey is not quiet. He's swimming from one branch to another branch. So the mind, similarly the mind arising in the growth of objects. Growth of objects means there are many different kinds of sense objects. Even we take example of the sound, or there are many different types of sound, voice, voice of different persons, and so on. So the mind arising in the growth of object is like the monkey wandering through the forest growth. So the mind taking hold of an object is like the monkey grabbing hold of a branch. So just as a monkey roaming through the forest leaves behind one branch and grips hold of another, so the mind roaming through the growth of object arises sometimes grasping hold of a visible object, sometimes a sound, sometimes the mind has gone into the past, into the memory, sometimes the present, or fantasizing the future, sometimes grasping an internal object, sometimes an external object. So when the monkey does not find a new branch, then he does not descend and sit on the ground, but sit holding to a single leafy branch. So when if there's no new branch, the monkey does not come down and sitting on the ground, but sit holding to a single leafy branch. Similarly, when the mind is roaming through the growth of object, it cannot be said that it arises without holding to an object. Rather, it arises holding to an object of a single kind. So this simile explains that the mind or consciousness is arising dependent on object. If there's no object, the mind or consciousness can't arise. So just now the scriptures say that arises as one thing and ceases as another by day and by night. Actually, the mind or the consciousness does not last that long. It does not mean that the mind arises in the daytime, you pass away at the night time, or a mind arises at daytime, but something else totally different you see at the night time. As you know, the arising and passing away of the mind consciousness is very swift or very rapid. The Buddha say there is no simile. The Tathagata can't find a simile to compare the swiftness of the mind, or the mind is arising and passing away so swift, so quick, so rapid. According to these explanations, this monkey simile here does not explain merely that the mind is always dependent on the object. It's not referring to restlessness of the mind. So similarly, when we practice mindfulness meditation, Vipassana meditation, we have to realize the mind or consciousness, in other words, the mindfulness or the noting mind is arising dependent on the object. If there's no object, the mindfulness can't arise. But at the beginning of practice, the mindfulness is quite weak, and meditators have not yet attained deep concentration. So they need to put forth mental effort to develop the mindfulness. They have to direct the mindfulness or the intention of mind to the objects. For example, at the beginning of sitting meditation, if the mindfulness is not matured, that mindfulness will not go to the object by itself. Especially beginners, if the beginners do not direct the mindfulness to the basic object, or in other words, movement rising, falling, in Pali it's known as mula kammatthana, then the mind will be wandering, thinking, and so on. Similarly, those who have experience in mindfulness meditation, if they have stopped the practice for quite some time, or they only practice an hour a day, the mindfulness could be quite weak at the beginning of retreats. So they have to make some effort to direct the mindfulness or the attention of mind to the movements of rising falling. If the movements of rising falling is not clear, or it seems there is no movements at all, then meditators should direct the mind to the alternative. In other words, the sitting postures and two clear touching points. So if the meditators did not make an effort to direct the mind to an object, then the mind may stay quiet or idle. You may remember this morning, one meditator said that when the movements stop, pause for quite some time, then the mindfulness is staying there. Either he make an effort to keep the mindfulness there, or if he doesn't make an effort, the mind may just stay quiet. So that's why we need to put forth effort to direct the mindfulness to a distinct object or to the alternative, the sitting postures and the contact or touching points. So meditators need to train the mindfulness to lead the mind to the object. Or in other words, meditators have to activate the mind. The meaning of activating the mind means you have to direct the mind to the object, from one object to next object. Sometimes meditators could put forth a lot of effort. For example, to focus their mindfulness on the movements of rising, falling during sitting meditation. Even though they know there's a thinking going on, then they still have the idea that the mindfulness is still staying with the movements of rising, falling. So it shows that the mindfulness is not active and alert. But when mindfulness is active and alert, the mindfulness will not stay with the movements of rising, falling at that time. The mindfulness will note the thinking mind instantly or immediately. So we always emphasize that meditators should develop active mindfulness. So when the mindfulness is active, then that active mindfulness will be able to perceive the arising of the object or the phenomenon quite instantly. So meditators need to direct the mindfulness to the basic object, movements of rising, falling, or sitting, touching. As they are mindful of the movement of abdomens, or the sitting postures, or one of the touching points, sometimes they may perceive that the mindfulness move to another object by itself. Maybe that object is a new object or stronger object. So the mindfulness or attention mind run to that object very rapidly. So the mindfulness or attention mind is attracted by the other object. So the mindfulness can't stay with one object. But in the practice of mindfulness meditation, we need to develop the mindfulness so that the mindfulness is getting more and more attentive and precise and energetic. When attentive and precise mindfulness is constant and continuous, then meditators will begin to gain some concentration. In other words, moment-to-moment concentration or momentary concentration. Then meditators will begin to gain some experience of Vipassana meditation. If meditators let the mind going to one object, one after another, very rapidly, sometimes they could not realize the true nature of the object. As long as meditators have not attained momentary concentration, if they are mindful of many objects, they may not able to realize the true nature of the phenomena clearly. For example, during walking meditation, you mindful and note the movements of the foot, lifting, pushing, dropping. When you mindful lifting, then there's a sound appear, you note hearing, then mindful lifting or pushing. Then there's a noise appear, you note hearing, come back to movements again. Then you feel a little bit of itchiness appearing on the face, you note itchy. So the mind keep on running from one object to next object. Um, so, so meditators may not be able to develop more and more attentive and precise mindfulness. So that's why we have to lay down a guideline or the principle of mindfulness meditation. For example, during walking meditation, if there's movements of fruits, such as lifting process, pushing process, then meditators have to put forth enough effort so that the mindfulness could follow the process of movements from the beginning to the middle of the process till the ending of that process. So similarly, when there's a pushing movements, meditators try to mindful of the process pushing movements and make an effort so that the mindfulness is staying with the movements of pushing until the end. But sometimes when meditators are mindful, one of the processor movements, and then there's a stronger object rising. That object is very distinct, very dominant. Then the mindfulness or the attention mind will definitely move to that dominant object. For example, the sensation, the itchiness, the meditators are mindful of that sensation, noting itchy, and so on. So meditators need to put forth enough effort to keep the mindfulness staying with the most dominant object. Or during walking meditation, they might have to put forth effort to keep the mindfulness staying with the processor movements. So during the practice of walking meditation, since meditators have to mindful of the processor movements, because at that present moment there are these processor movements, lifting, pushing, dropping. So they have to keep the mindfulness with the process of lifting, process pushing, and so on. But as long as the mindfulness and concentration are not strong enough, then when meditators are mindful of the movements of lifting or movements of pushing, sometimes they're still conscious of other sense phenomenon. For example, as they are mindful of the process of lifting, pushing forward of the right foot, they may conscious of the pressing of the left foot on the floor. Or sometimes they hear some sound or noise. So meditators need not have to take note of the pressing of the left foot or the hearing of some noise or sound. In other words, as long as meditators are able to pay attention to the processor movements, lifting, pushing, dropping, then they may ignore the sound or the pressing of the left foot. So as long as you are able to pay attention to the most distinct object or the most dominant object that's arising at that moment, then you do not have to mindful and note other less distinct objects, or even though you are conscious of other less distinct objects. So in that way, meditators will be able to develop more and more attentive, precise mindfulness. So when meditators have to mindful of any object or phenomena, for example the movements, they need to put forth effort to perceive the movements. The way of mindfulness is different from the way of concentration. When you practice concentration meditation, you might have to concentrate your mind strongly on the object of concentration, as if the mind is being absorbed into the objects. But when we practice mindfulness meditation, what should be emphasized is the mental factors of mindfulness or awareness. So when you're mindful of the movements of lifting, pushing, or you do practice mindfulness of daily activities, such as stretching up your arms, bending your arms, lifting up, and so on. You need to put forth enough effort to perceive the movements. There's a process movement, there's a process movements that's going on at a time. But you focus your attention strongly on the physical arm, you may not able to perceive the movement clearly. Similarly, during walking meditation, you focus your attention strongly on the physical foots. You may not able to perceive the movements clearly. So during the practice of mindfulness meditation, what should be realized is the process movements. Or when you're mindful of pain, you perceive there's a process of pain. You do not focus your attention strongly at the place of the pain. You may experience yourself now. You may close your eyes and lift up your hands slowly. When you lift up your hand, you know there's a process movements there. But you focus your attention strongly on the physical arm. You may not able to perceive the movement so clearly, but you may perceive certain sensation arising at the place of focusing. So what should be realized is the movements. Movements is the ultimate realities. So when meditators could develop mindfulness sometimes from one object to next object, then gradually they come to realize that when there's an object, then there's a arising of a process of mindfulness or awareness, or sometimes known as the noting mind. For example, when you're mindful of the movements of rising, falling, then a strong painful sensation is arising. If your mindfulness is active, the mindfulness will appear at the place where there's a strong painful sensation. It's no longer with the movements of rising or falling. So since the painful sensation is stronger than the movements of rising, falling, then you need to follow your mindfulness and note pain. Sometimes, as you're mindful of pain, you realize that there's a desire to move or to change your sitting postures. When you realize there's a desire, we can say that mindfulness has arisen and noticing the desire. Then you have to note desire. When desire has disappeared, assuming that the pain is still a stronger object, the mindfulness will appear there immediately in the next moment. But if you exercise control over the process of mindfulness, then you cannot realize that the mindfulness is arising dependent on the object. Um, um, so we do not exercise a strong control over the process of mindfulness. Um, you do not have to bring your mindfulness from one object to next object when you are able to practice better and better. The mindfulness will go to the distinct object by itself. Um, that's why the manifestation of mindfulness, as explained in the Abhidharma, mindfulness is manifested as a mental state turning towards the object, coming face to face with the object. But when the mindfulness is not strong, that weak mindfulness could be distracted easily by less distinct object. For example, as you mindful of movement rising or falling, sometimes the movements of rising falling could be quite clear, but there's a little noise appearing. The mind immediately go to that noise. Then it show that the mindfulness is not attentive, precise. So if the mindfulness is attentive and precise, the mindfulness always staying with the most dominant object that's arising in the body. And if the mindfulness active, alert, the mindfulness will perceiving the arising of mental states, such as thinking, planning, instantly. So meditators have to realize that mindfulness is arising dependent depending on the object or phenomenon. If there's no phenomenon, the mindfulness can't arise. So similarly, when you're mindful of the movement of rising, when rising movements has stopped or disappear, then you should not keep your mindfulness there. You might have to direct your mindfulness to the sitting postures and the touching point. But when you are able to attain deeper and deeper concentration, then you might realize that when the process of rising movements had disappeared at that moment, the process of mindfulness also will disappear almost at the same moment. This is explained clearly in the scriptures. Whatever conditioned phenomena, sometimes known as Sankata Dharma, or Sankata means a phenomenon or object or anything arising dependent on the condition. So because it's arising dependent on a condition, you can see this phenomena is arising. Then you can see the passing away. While arising, when that phenomena is persisting, it keep on changing. It won't stay the same. And finally, it will pass away by itself. So whatever arising dependent on condition is definitely not permanent, not everlasting. So the mindfulness that's arising dependent object is also not a permanent process. Sometimes we give the examples of the six consciousness. As you know, there are six consciousness: consciousness of seeing, consciousness of hearing, consciousness of smelling, consciousness of tasting, consciousness of touching, and cognizing, the process of consciousness that cognize the mental object. So how does this consciousness arise? If there's no external sense object, for example, a sound or noise, then do you think that the consciousness can arise? But because there's a sound comes to contact with the ear door, then consciousness arising, perceiving the sound. So that consciousness is known as hearing consciousness or ear consciousness. So what comes to realize that there's a arising of hearing consciousness? So that arising of consciousness is perceiving by the following mind or consciousness, which is known as awareness or mindfulness in the practice of mindfulness meditation. So in other words, because there's a arising of the cause, the sound or the noise, then the effect is the arising of the hearing consciousness. So if the mindfulness is sharp, then one will perceive the arising of hearing consciousness. So this hearing consciousness becomes a cause. The arising of the mindfulness or awareness is the effect. But as long as mindfulness and concentration are not strong enough, meditators might not be able to perceive the arising of consciousness clearly. Most likely, the attention mind would have gone to the sound or the noise, the object, the external objects. So meditators need to cultivate the mindfulness or develop the mindfulness so that they come to realize the arising of mindfulness is dependent on the object. So this is explained clearly also in the commentary as well. Under the chapter in the commentary here refers to the path of purification of Visuddhimagga. In the chapter on the purification of view. So this chapter explains about interdependence of mentality and materialities. So this mentality and materiality are arising dependent on each other's. Mentality can't arise without materiality, and sometimes materiality can't arise without mentality. So the commentary explains with the various simile, such as when sound occurs when the drum is beaten by the stick. So the commentary explains that the drum is one and the sound another. The drum and the sound are not mixed up together. The drum is void of sound and the sound is void of the drum. Similarly, the arising or the occurrence of mentality that have the support of materiality. So mentality is one, materiality or physicality is another. So the mentality and materiality of physicality are not mixed out together. In other words, the mentality is void of physicality, and the physicality or mentality is void of the mentality. So that's why the ancient teachers say that the mind and the body, or the mental and materials, are twins, and each support the other. When one breaks up, then they both break up through interconditionality. they condition each other to arise. So when one is conditioned by the other had passed away, definitely the one which is conditioned by the other also is subject to passing away. So it's difficult to see this conditionality unless you could develop your mindfulness in the correct way. In fact, meditators aspire to make progress. First thing they have to realize is the conditionality, or sometimes it's known as cause and effect. You meditators could not experience the relationship between the mentality and physicality, or the object and the mindfulness, or the noting mind, then they may not able to realize there are three common characteristics clearly. Only one who could see all these phenomena as conditioned phenomena, then they can realize there are three common characteristics: anicca, dukkha, anatta. Sometimes we may have the idea, seeing the form of the abdomen keep on changing. For example, there's expansion of the abdomen, and then we might note it as rising. We see the form of abdomen expanding. Then the form of abdomen is contracting, moving inwards. So we see the changes in the form of the abdomen, moving or expanding, contracting. Sometimes the expansion of the abdomen could be quite large, sometimes quite small, or sometimes the contraction of the abdomen is quite large, and so on. So when we see these changes in the form of the movements or the form of abdomens, we might think that we are seeing impermanent or anicca. But we cannot see anicca in any form or concept. We can only see anicca in the ultimate realities. So in other words, meditators have to realize the specific characteristics or individual characteristics of the mental and physical phenomena clearly. For example, when meditators could mindful and note various process of movements more attentively, precisely, then they come to experience clearly the process of movements. In other words, meditators only perceiving a movements or process movements, such as the process of rising movements or process of falling movements during sitting meditation, or they could perceive there's process of lifting movements or process of pushing movements. So meditators experience merely movements, and then they could perceive that there's a process of awareness or mindfulness or noting the movements. So as you know, movements is one of the ultimate realities, which is the manifestations of the wind element. So when they could perceive the movement clearly, then they come to realize the mindfulness is arising dependent on the movements, for example during sitting meditation. If there's a process of rising movements, then there's a process of mindfulness rising and noting that movement. So if there's no process rising movements, then there's no arising or appearing of the mindfulness or the noting mind. If there's no pain, then there's no arising of mindfulness noting the pain. But it's because there's a pain arising, then the mindfulness is arising and note the pain. So meditators come to realize during the sitting meditation, the mindfulness is arising dependent on the phenomenon or the object. Then when they practice walking meditation or training themselves to mindful of the daily activities such as eating breakfast, lunch, then they come to realize physicality is arising depending on the mentality. In other words, meditators realize that every process movements is preceded by intention. This mental self-intention is also a natural mental process. There's no I or self behind this intention. Meditators realize the arising of the intention is a natural process. Then because there's intention, movements is also happening or occurring naturally. So in other words, movements is physicality, or in other words, one of physical phenomena. That physical movements is dependent on the mentality. In other words, the mind, or in other words, the intending mind, or mental volition. So meditators come to realize the interdependence of the mentality and physicality. They are conditioned each other's. Sometimes the physical phenomenon condition the arising of the mental phenomenon or mentality. In other words, the noting mind. But sometimes the mentality condition the arising of physicality. In other words, the mind or the intending mind condition the arising of the physical process or the physical movements. So only meditators could realize that the interdependence of the mentality and physicality. Then they only begins to realize the three common characteristics. In other words, every mental phenomenon, every physical phenomenon has these three characteristics. They are common to them. They are anicca, dukkha, anatta. So our aim of practicing mindfulness meditation or Vipassana meditation is to realize the three common characteristics through personal experience or direct experience. But meditators need to realize clearly the individual characteristics of mental and physical phenomena clearly. Then they only come to realize there are three common characteristics. So when meditators realize the specific characteristics of the mental and physical phenomena, they also come to realize the interdependence of these two phenomena. When one is arising, then the other would arise at the same moment. We can say at the same moment. So we have to realize that the process of mindfulness is not a permanent process. And do you think that there's a single process of mindfulness, or there are many processes of mindfulness? There are many processes of mindfulness, and each process mindfulness is only perceive one object. So that's why it's explained in the scriptures and the commentary. It arises holding to an object of a single kind. So, in other words, the mindfulness perceives one object of a single kind. The mindfulness or the mind cannot perceive two different phenomena at the same moment. Similarly, even the same nature of phenomena. For example, when you hear the voice of two different persons, you are not hearing the voice at the same moment. The voice of first person, then the voice of the second person. But when you develop deeper concentration, then you come to realize that the mindfulness perceiving one object at each moment. So at that time, meditators will attain deep concentration, sometimes known as momentary concentration. So when meditators come to realize momentary concentration, they experience that every object is arising and passing away very instantly. Even though they are mindful of the movements of rising, falling continuously, they come to realize rising movements is an object. Then when there's rising movements, there's a process of mindfulness arising almost at the same moment. When the rising movements had disappeared, that process of mindfulness that had been noting that movements also subject to passing away. When the process of falling movements appear, then there will be another process of process of mindfulness appear, note the falling movements. When falling movements had disappeared, that process of mindfulness also subject to passing away or vanishing. So even though meditators are mindful of not rising, falling continuously, assuming that there is no other object, if they develop the mindfulness correctly, then they gain the insight knowledge of impermanence. They come to realize the object, the movements, and the noting mind or the mindfulness are arising and passing away instantly. But if the meditators could not develop the mindfulness correctly, then they might think that there's a process of mindfulness that has been following, noting the movements of rising, falling constantly and continuously. So meditators should be able to make a distinction whether you are practicing mindfulness or inclining towards developing concentration. So this is important. So in this sutta, just now I only quote one paragraph. In fact, this sutta was the title of this sutta is uninstructed. It means the Buddha was talking about uninstructed disciples. Uninstructed means those willing do not have much wisdoms, devoid of learning, so they do not understand much about what called the five aggregates or elements, cause and effect, or conditionality, the establishment of mindfulness, and so on. So their ignorance about this profound teaching of Buddha. When you could realize cause and effect or continuity of the phenomena, and then you come to understand one of the very profound teachings of the Buddha, there's dependent origination or paticca samuppada. There's a saying that if one wishes to see the Dharma, one must see dependent origination. One see the dependent origination, one see the Dharma. So it's so important to realize that the teaching of dependent origination, or in brief known as conditionality, through the practice of mindfulness meditation or Vipassana meditation. It is difficult to realize these profound teachings. The scriptures explain the monkey mind. It doesn't mean the mind is restless, because the mind is like to grasping various sense objects. So that's why you need to develop the mind. So that's why the commentary say that the mind consciousness element should be regarded as a forest monkey, because it does not stay still on its object. But in mindfulness, we in the mindfulness practice, we make an effort to keep the mindfulness staying with the strongest object, so that we come to realize the true nature of that object. When we are able to realize the true nature of that object, then we begin to gain some wisdoms or insight knowledge. Then the commentary explains further, or as a wild horse, or because it's difficult to tame, or as a stick thrown into the air, because it falls anyhow, or as a stage dancer, because the stage dancer is disguising herself in various costumes. So similarly, as this mind consciousness regarded as a stage dancer, because it adopts the guise of the various defilements such as greed, hatred, and so on. So it is important to tame the mind. When you're able to tame your mind, then you're able to develop wisdoms, or to realize or to see things as they really are. Then eventually you could overcoming or removing your mental defilements, and attain enlightenment. So in other words, mindful of the mind is very important. As you might have heard that mind your mind, or the wise tame themselves. But if there's no other mental states arising, then you should be very mindful of other physical phenomena or body sensations. Whenever there's a mental states arising, you should be mindful and note it as it really occurs, or mindful of that mental state till that mental state has disappeared by itself. Then in the next moment, you may mindful of one of the physical phenomena. If, for example, hot, feeling hot is very clear, you're mindful of it. If coldness is very clear, mindful of coldness. If there's no other clear phenomenon, then you should be quick enough to come back to a basic object, either movement rising, falling, or sitting, or the touching point. So meditators need to be patient and need to put forth effort and endow with this quality of perseverance. So that means you are able to put forth effort, not giving up, um, activating your mind in order to mindful and note constantly. Then when your mindfulness is getting more and more constant and continuous, there's no disruptions or interruptions of the mindfulness, then you are able to gain deep concentration and clear experience. So the immediate purpose of mindfulness meditation is to strengthen the power of mindfulness. If you could do that, then you may able to gain some concentration and experience. So I wish all meditators rightly understands the technique and the guideline of mindfulness meditation, so that you could develop mindfulness in, correctly, rightly, and eventually gain much personal experience of the true nature of the nama rupa, or mental physical phenomena, and overcoming your mental defilements and attaining ultimate purity of mind.